All right, so we can go ahead and get started. My neighbor picked a heck of a time to start mowing his lawn. I don't know if you all can hear that. But I mean, the fun of live webinars, I guess. So I'll hurry up and then make sure to mute myself when I'm not speaking. But welcome everyone to today's webinar, Managing Relationships in Quarantine. My name is Aaron Hunt. I'm a rising fourth year PhD student in clinical psychology at George Mason. I'll let my co-facilitator, Sarah Giff, introduce herself.
Hi, like Aaron said, I'm Sarah. I'm a rising sixth year in the clinical psychology program at George Mason. So, yep.
Exciting. All right. So this is our second week in a three-part webinar series on mental health and wellness during quarantine. We're skipping next week due to Memorial Day, and we'll be picking up on June 1st. So hope to see everyone then. And at that time, we'll be discussing navigating loss of normalcy and future uncertainty during quarantine. And again, today we're talking about managing relationships. So today we're going to talk about how different relationships might be affected, different types of communication skills, validation and compassion, and then we will definitely leave some time at the end for a Q&A, and any comments, anything you want to say about relationships or sharing your experiences with others, as well as any questions you have about relationships in quarantine, whether or not it's related to what was shared today. So without further ado, we'll jump right in and talk about how different relationships may be affected. So Sarah and I specifically wanted to talk about 4 different types of relationships that might be affected by quarantine. So with roommates, one of the main differences is that you might be seeing a lot more of your roommates than you're used to, especially if you usually are on different schedules or that type of thing. You definitely are going to be, with your quarantining, seeing each other a lot more of the time. And, you know, there might be differences in how close you are to different roommates, and you're facing new challenges together.
And so in the spirit of that, so you might be spending a lot more like proximal time with people that you might not actually be that close with. So really coming up with some practical and concrete rules will be really hopefully helpful and essential. So there's a long list of maybe different considerations that you can talk with people about here. Especially thinking about if everyone people are working from home in the same, maybe smaller space. So those kind of practical things of how to use space, but also thinking about health and safety. So people are going to have different maybe preferences with how strict or not strict different roommates are. They are with social distancing and keeping the place clean. And so I think making sure everybody's on the same page for that is going to be really helpful. And I think also maybe setting up some different, maybe like a weekly check-in so that people can kind of tweak rules as things change and as the situation shifts, and as maybe you set a rule about something that maybe didn't really go that well over the past week, and to have a space where people can kind of make sure they talk about it can be really helpful. Another thing that is really not fun to talk about or think about can be really necessary is having a plan for what everybody's going to do in the household or the apartment. If someone is symptomatic, maybe with COVID-19, or maybe you're not really sure, and that can really help whoever the person is who's experiencing those symptoms feel better coming forward, because that person's probably also feeling a little scared, and knowing that there's a plan in place can be really helpful for everybody involved. And the last thing here, which is actually going to carry over probably into any relationship that you're having with anybody right now, is being direct with your concerns is going to be really important. No one has time to decipher your passive-aggressive sticky note that you leave on the refrigerator. This is really a time to say what you want and why, and make sure that you're kind of open to receiving that from other people as well. So hopefully those will be things that can help smooth over any roommate difficulties people may be having.
And we'll offer some strategies on best ways to do that too today.
Yeah.
So, okay. So next we kind of want to talk about friends, which obviously some of these categories move over into each other, but we also want to talk about friends. I'm a fairly social person. It's very different for me to not be seeing my friends as often as I'm used to, especially as a student. I was used to, going to school, seeing lots of people on campus, seeing lots of people at work, that kind of thing. And so very different to not be running into people. And it's definitely a time where it can be very easy to feel socially isolated.
Yeah, so this is to kind of ease that social isolation. That's going to be really important to be really intentional about cultivating these relationships and keeping them with your friends. You might have friends who have different expectations about how much they want to check in or hang out. So being open about that kind of stuff up front can be really helpful. It can also be really important to remember to mark those big milestones that your friends might be having that might usually be celebrated in person that y'all are having to miss out on. So especially recently, a lot of graduations. I've seen a lot of people get creative with ways to celebrate things like that for friends, as well as things like birthdays or things that maybe they had to postpone or move, like weddings, and just kind of making sure you're reaching out and telling people that the days that they thought were special are still really special and that you're thinking about them. And this is also just a list of ideas here for kind of fun activities you can do with your friends still from a distance. There's a ton of different games you can play on Zoom, as I'm sure a lot of people have started to figure out. You can start organizing things like book clubs. I've heard of people sending each other, set up with their friends, I'm going to surprise you with takeout at your door tonight, setting up different things like that. Kind of get fun and get creative with ways to kind of keep checking in with one another and maintaining that closeness with your friends, because that is really, really important to do right now when you're not seeing them in person.
Definitely. So next we want to talk about family members, which might mean that you are at home with family all of the time, which might be very different, or you are not seeing your family maybe as much as you're used to. And so, yeah, definitely something to consider. There are many different experiences that people are having with family members right now.
Yes. And this is another one where just kind of open communication can be really helpful and important. And thinking about it, especially if you're seeing or not seeing other people, being really cognizant of different health concerns of multi-generational families is going to be really important. So coming up with ways to connect, maybe if you're at distance, and then also making sure that you're kind of making space to kind of give each other space if you are sharing a lot of space together also.
And then we also want to talk about romantic relationships. Similar to families, you might find that you are suddenly in kind of a long distance romantic relationship with your significant other, or maybe you are very much always together in a way that you normally are not, and without the break of seeing other types of people and living in very close quarters.
Yeah. And so these are the kind of things we'll kind of get more into some of these things. But especially if you're spending a lot more time in the same space with someone, it's really important to remember that just because it might feel like you're spending a lot of time with your significant other, and like in theory you're in the same space all the time, but it's really important to be intentional about still making quality time for one another. So making time for that shared time together and making time to make sure you're intentionally spending time apart, because both are really essential to maintaining a healthy relationship. It also will be really important to make sure you're dividing household responsibilities evenly, especially for couples who have kids. Um, and this is kind of like you want to get creative with making spaces with your friends to connect. Get a little bit more intentional and creative about some date nights too. That's kind of part of making that intentional time together. And then if you do, as Erin, find yourself in these long distance relationships, maybe out of nowhere, or maybe due to like the way somebody has to interact with people who might be impacted by coronavirus, this can be a really helpful time if you can't be physically together to work on building that emotional intimacy and kind of strengthening your bond. And people are doing a lot of this synchronous video chat. But also there's a lot of research out there showing that doing communication that is asynchronous or like not, it's not happening at the same time can be really helpful for strengthening relationships. So if it means like writing each other letters or sending a card or doing some things like that that are a little bit less, I don't know, less modern, less technology involved, can be kind of helpful and kind of mix it up for fun.
Sure. So now we want to, we just talked a lot about how important it is to use great and very effective communication skills during this time. We don't want to leave you hanging. So we're going to move into discussing some different communication skills that we think could be really helpful, especially always, but especially right now in quarantine. So right off the bat, it's important to make sure that you're practicing patience, both with yourself and with other people. And so taking time to pause and reflect and think about what you want to say, play it in your head a couple times before you speak, especially if it's something a request you're nervous about making or you're responding to something that can possibly be a little heated or touchy. If you notice that you're feeling frustrated, take a moment to do some deep breathing. Um, Make sure to communicate directly when you need space to think about something, whether that means going like, thank you for saying that, I need some time to think about that, or I'm starting to feel frustrated, can we pick this up in half an hour? And so maybe setting a time to talk about it in the future so you can dry your thoughts. And so that being said, kind of a common theme with all of these is that you are not responding immediately when someone says something. And so definitely take this time to normalize not answering someone right away, especially when the conversation is a little tough or maybe you're having a disagreement. It can be great during this time to practice that is actually a very normal thing to want to think about what you want to say to someone else when they're speaking to you. I wanted to take a moment to talk about something called switch tracking, which is getting a little into the pop psychology field. However, I think that it can be very helpful to think about, and also the notion that Western empiricism is the only way for things to exist is quite flawed. So switch tracking is well noted. And really, switch tracking just means when you and somebody else think you're having the same conversation and you're absolutely not. And so that's my personal version of what switch tracking is. I think the more academic version is when someone makes a request and you respond with a different request. So for example, I have here a short conversation between a husband and wife, and the husband says, I bought you roses. And the wife says, I've told you before that I hate roses. And the husband says, wow, you are so ungrateful. And the wife says, you never listen to me. So you can see right here, when I'm breaking it down with this context, you can see that the husband and wife are having two different conversations right now, even though they think they're having the same one. So the husband feels that the wife is not being grateful for the gift that he's brought to her. And the wife feels that the husband is continuing not to listen to her when she's expressing her preferences for things. And so both of these are valid conversations, and both of these are important conversations. It's important for the husband to tell his wife that he feels that he's maybe being taken for granted. That's an important thing to communicate in a relationship. And it's important for the wife to communicate to the husband that she feels that that she's not being heard, which is another very important thing to communicate in a relationship. So how can this be avoided? Ask yourself in a disagreement, especially, what is each person trying to communicate? And so as I said there, the husband was attempting to communicate that he didn't feel appreciated when he felt he was going out of his way to do something nice. And the wife felt that she was not being heard by the husband because she'd been given feedback to him that he did not accept. So recognize what the other person is saying, reflect that back to them, and then you can choose to redirect the conversation either to what they're talking about or to what you're talking about. And it's okay to literally say, I think we're having two different conversations. You feel that I don't listen to you, and I feel like I sometimes am taken for granted. So let's talk about how you feel like I don't listen, or how you're feeling unheard right now based on what you're saying. Make sure that you spend equal time for each subject. So if you need to talk about someone feeling like they're not being appreciated, and need to talk about someone feeling like they're not being heard, make sure that you spend time discussing both of those in earnest, and that you can be collaborative about how you have those conversations. So it sounds like we're having two different conversations right now. Both of them are very important. Which one would you like to talk about first? And let's keep it really focused to that. And then keep it really focus to that one subject, and you can keep asking yourself, are we still talking about this one subject? And then making sure you go back to the other one. Another really important skill is to keep using non-judgmental, unbiased language. So we truly don't know anyone else's true intentions and motives. So therefore, especially during quarantine, but always, it is very helpful to assume the best. So it can be helpful to utilize I statements. So because I don't know what you think or you feel, I do know how I think and feel. And so I can discuss that I am feeling this way, I am having these thoughts, I am responding in this way, I am engaging in these behaviors, and those are things that we can communicate. So you can look at conflict from a growth perspective. This is a way for us to communicate with each other and for us to figure out an issue in our relationship. How can we address this issue in a collaborative way? Avoid labeling others' behavior and actions. So don't say, you did a bad thing, or you do this and it's so annoying. Rather, like, when you can say, maybe, when you do this, I feel this way, or I wonder if there's a more effective way for this to be done, or I wonder if we could work together to make this easier. Those are all things we can be saying instead of that. And we will also be discussing how to validate others later. And so there's a question that my dad used to say actually all the time when talking about relationships, and that is, would you rather be right or would you rather be happy? And so sometimes, even if you very objectively feel you are the right one in this situation and what you're doing is correct and the other person is wrong, sometimes it's more important to be happy, and that might mean taking the L or deciding, you know what, I'm going to give this one to you because you could use a win right now, or we can figure this out another time, because I'd rather that we both leave here feeling positively than leave here with one of us feeling like we won and the other one feeling like we're losing. Like, conflict doesn't have to be a competition.
And I think on that note, it is easy, I think, sometimes to think about conflict as maybe always a problem or a competition, but it's also a really important way that we can grow and learn about our friends and our loved ones, and kind of lay things out there that are really important to talk about. So what I'm going to talk about next is a tool that is really helpful for having tough conversations. And this can be when you really need to make a request of somebody. Maybe it's about a behavior change, or you can just say no to somebody, which is not always easy to do, especially when you love them. And so it can also be really helpful with setting those limits and boundaries. This is called the DEARMAN skill. It's one of my favorites. And so the dear and that we're going to learn about reminds us of what to say. And then the man is going to show us how to say it. And so the what to say, so the D, it's like, it's an acronym. So the D stands for describe. What we want to start with is only facts that are really for the current situation. We don't want to include any judgmental language here. As Erin mentioned earlier, that can be really important. And this is not the time to go back digging all the other times that somebody's really bothered you. So an example that's easy usually to walk through this with is, say you want to ask your roommate to, they left all their dishes in the sink. It's something that bothers you and you would like to ask them to please make sure they clean the dishes. So doing this describing the situation in a way of just facts would just say, hey, there's some dishes in the sink that I think are yours. Rather than saying, there's so many gross dishes in the sink, you're disgusting, you've been doing this all week, you do this all the time. So don't dig up any of that other stuff. Just focus on the here and now, which is that there are dishes in the sink. The next one, the E is for express. And this is where, like Erin said, you want to use your I statements to express your own feelings and opinions. And this is a really important step because people, as we mentioned also earlier, people cannot read your mind. It's really important to put out there actually so the other person knows what they are doing does make you feel. And this is also kind of like a humanizing element. So this can be where people can kind of help, you can kind of help get them on your side of like, oh, I didn't realize that it made you feel that way. So if you say, hey, it really, makes me worried when you leave all those in the sink because I know we've had an ant problem in the past and I really, don't really want to have more ants showing up or something like that. So that's a really important piece. And then The asserting one is really the part where you ask for what you want. So this is where you say, no, I can't do that, or this is really, could you please do this for me differently, or what I really need to happen. Here you really need to be clear what you want. And in that clarity, especially when you're asking for a request, it's gonna be really helpful to be very, very concrete and clear. So if you ask your roommate, can you just make sure you clean the dishes more often? Both parties might interpret more often a little bit more differently. But if you are saying, hey, actually, I'd really appreciate if we can just make sure the dishes are clear by the end of the night before you go to sleep, that's a little bit more concrete. So those little tiny things can make a big difference when you're asking for what you want to make sure everybody's on the same page. And the R, the last one, stands for reinforce. And this is where you really want to think about how this may not only benefit you, but also how this thing that you're asking for may benefit another person, the other person you're talking to. Again, this is trying to get them on board with you. So if you say, if you try to make sure you wash your dishes, like, I'll make sure I wash mine, and this is great for both of us because then we'll have a clean apartment. And this is also where you can express some appreciation. Say, thank you for considering this thing of mine that it's really important to me. So that's the kind of what to say. And so that's what we kind of use to create a script when we have a hard thing that we want to talk about with somebody. And the man on the other side helps us figure out how we want to say it, because it can really come across differently based on your tone and what can happen in the conversation. And so the M stands for mindful. So this is really where you want to stay on topic. And so sometimes in these conversations, maybe one about doing dishes, people can get distracted by other arguments and then actually kind of fall into that switch tracking sometimes that Erin was talking about earlier. So if you bring up dishes, maybe the roommate decides to bring up they don't like that you left your muddy boots somewhere else. So you can stay mindful in the present one and say, okay, I understand your concern, but let's finish talking about my thing first. The second one is appearing confident. So your posture and tone and body language are very important. So you want to make sure you are looking someone in the eye, you're not mumbling, you're not looking at the ground. You also want to make sure you don't veer too far in the other direction. So you don't want to yell at people, and you want to make sure you're kind of open to have a conversation with someone. And the last part is also important because you want to be willing a little bit to negotiate. So before you go into a conversation like this, you want to think about maybe where you're willing to negotiate and maybe where you're willing to draw some lines and boundaries. So maybe if you ask your roommate for, I wish you would do them at the end of every night before you go to bed, maybe they'll say, can you give me just 2 nights? Maybe I'll leave everything in there for 2 nights. And be willing to think about maybe giving a little bit if that still kind of gets you a little bit more of what you want in the long run. So the dear is the script and the man is kind of the approach of the mindset you want to go in with. And so we have a couple examples of conversations you might be having that might apply to situations you might be in with coronavirus. So if we're making a request, we have one that involves, asking a roommate maybe or somebody you live with to wash their hands a little bit more frequently. And the second one, I think, is about asking for a little bit more time and space in the living space that you share with somebody for a big meeting. So I don't know if anybody wants to have one. Is one more applicable for people than the other? I'll give you guys, if you want to pick one, choose hand washing or space in the apartment for work.
You're welcome to either unmute yourself and chime in, or you can send a private chat to Sarah or I.
Yes.
So either cleanliness or quiet time. You can pick one, we'll go over it together. In the meantime, I'll write a DEARMAN to discuss with my neighbor about his lawn care needs and my needs to do webinars and see patients in the evenings.
Yep. Okay, so I actually did just get a private message, someone requesting the one that we're on now, which is the kind of using space to work in shared space you have with somebody. So we have check marks towards that kind of show what would be a helpful thing to say that would follow the DEARMAN principles, and some red X's showing things that might not be so helpful to say and are in contrast with our DEARMAN principles. So I'm going to read them through the good ones and then through the bad ones. So the helpful way to say it could be first by describing, I have a big presentation with my boss today and I need a quiet space. That's just facts. Expressing would be, I would like to make a good impression. So my boss knows how hard I've worked on this project, and I worry noisy interruptions will throw me off my game. So that way you're telling them how you feel and that this is really important to you. And then, so for asserting what you need, you could say, will you be able to walk the dog during my meeting at 11 a.m. so I'm not distracted by either of you? And you'll notice there that they, this person put in like a concrete time, and also kind of gave a suggestion for something that they were hoping that could be done, not just like be quiet. For reinforcing, saying, I'll make sure I do the same for you, your next big meeting too. So kind of showing that you're willing to give a little bit. And in contrast, maybe the not so helpful way to ask for this is saying, you'll probably be yelling on all of our work calls today as usual, right? You don't seem to care about my work at all. You better be quiet today. And if not, don't worry about it. I know your work is more important than mine. So in a way, I think these are kind of different traps that it's kind of easy to fall into, of maybe being a little bit more passive aggressive or maybe being more aggressive and judgy. But in the long run, I think the person who uses the green check marks and kind of follows these DEARMAN principles is probably more likely to have some peace and quiet during that presentation than someone who's using some of those statements that are with those red X's we have here. So that is one way example of how to use it for making a request. The other way that can be really helpful to use this is by saying no. And so the example we used here that we came up with was something that people might actually be grappling with is, what if your roommate or partner or somebody you live with wants to invite someone over for dinner? And people might have different feelings of how they want to go about that with different social or physical distancing practices. And so this one I'm going to start with the bad. I guess we don't use judgmental language, but the less helpful words. They're things that could be saying if somebody said, hey, would you be okay? Your roommate says, can my friend Julie come over for dinner? You could say, I can't believe people think it's okay to go have dinner at friends' houses. People are just being reckless. There's no way I'm letting anyone in our house. And you'll feel so bad if she comes over and we all get coronavirus. So that actually might work, and letting this Julie person might not come over, but your relationship with your roommate might not be so great after you say some of those things. So a more effective way you could talk about it would say, describing a little bit more factually, you asked if Julie could come over for dinner tonight. CDC still suggests that we keep up with physical social distancing. I'm trying to adhere to guidelines. You could say that it makes you not feel comfortable, and that you might just feel nervous about someone else sharing the space with us, and it's important that you feel safe at home. I'm not comfortable with Julie coming over for dinner. Please do not invite her. So that's very clear and concrete. That's less passive and less aggressive than any of the other ways to kind of say that. And then the reinforcing is also saying, I know this isn't easy for you. I appreciate you respecting our shared space. And offering to help, maybe we can brainstorm another way for you to see her without her coming over. So showing that you do care about this other person can go a long way in kind of having these discussions and the reinforcing piece. So yeah, that's how we can say no. And the next slide. The last thing I'll say about this, I won't spend too much time on this, is just that it's really important. This is a skill just like any other skill that anyone's ever learned, whether it's, baking or playing a sport, that it's really, really important to practice. And it's most helpful to practice these things in less emotional situations. So practice writing a script, practice talking to your partner about hard things in this way, so that when you guys really do get into a big fight, or you have a roommate who really asks you for something it's hard to say no to, you've had these skills built up and you've had this practice. And teach the people you live with or people you love these different skills, and you can explain them to them so that they can help you. You guys can support each other in learning these skills too.
All right, thank you so much, Sarah. So we're going to move into talking about validation and compassion, which are also important skills right now, especially when it comes to communication. So I wanted to talk about validating others, which maybe is the harder part for many people on the validating spectrum, and also very important when you're having to spend so much close time with people. So validation means finding that kernel of truth in another person's perspective or situation, verifying the facts of the situation. And so that is the only thing that needs to be involved in that part. And so acknowledging that their emotions, thoughts, and behaviors have causes and are therefore understandable. And then that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to agree with the other person. And that also doesn't mean that you need to validate what isn't actually valid about what they're saying. And so I think it's really important to like say that validating someone does not mean that you're agreeing with them. It's just recognizing their experience. And so validation is really important because it improves relationships by showing that we listen and understand. It improves interpersonal effectiveness by reducing the pressure to prove who's right, by reacting negatively, by reducing anger. It makes problem solving, closeness, and support possible. And also feeling invalidated really hurts. And it's hard for people to respond well or be open-minded to what you're saying if at the same time you're also hurting them in their feelings. So it's really important to validate just the things that are valid, the facts of a situation, a person's own experience, their emotions, beliefs, opinions, and thoughts are all valid, whether or not you agree with them or whether or not they even really reflect reality. And someone's suffering and difficulties are all things to validate. So I can validate someone's emotions even if I don't agree with them, and I can validate someone's perspective even if I think it's factually wrong. I can recognize that they have that perspective and that's driving their behavior, and that's different than agreeing with what they're saying. And then also just make sure that you remember that every invalid response makes sense in some way. Validation is not agreeing. Validation doesn't mean that you like it, and we're only validating things that are valid. So kind of a step-by-step approach is to pay attention to what they're saying, look interested, listen, and observe. Try not to multitask, try to be making eye contact while they're talking to you, and stay really focused on what they're saying. Use those active listening skills. Reflect back what they're saying. This can help to show that you're listening, and it also can make sure that you're understanding correctly. So when you say back what they're saying to them, it shows that you are listening, that you have an open mind, and also you can do this in a way, try to use a tone that shows that you're open to being corrected. So for example, so you're upset with me because you think that I lied to you to upset you on purpose. Did I get that right? And so then maybe if that's not what the person was trying to communicate, they can feel comfortable correcting you and hopefully in an effective way. So with reading minds, even though we made a joke earlier about how we can't read minds, this is just referring to there's kind of what is being said and what is not being said. And so anyone who's ever had a passive aggressive roommate can very much understand, or maybe a passive aggressive parent can very much understand what this is talking about. Is there's what people are saying and there's also what people are not saying. So really be mindful about what they're not saying. So whether that means looking at their facial expression, their body language, what's happening, what you know about the other person. So if you say something like, are you doing okay? And they're like, yeah, I'm fine. So obviously, even though that person said, yes, I'm fine, it might not take a mind reader to tell that they're upset. And so you can say, okay, you say that, and also I noticed that you're frowning, and so I wonder if you're feeling sad, and do you want to talk about that? Try to be understanding about how they feel, what they're thinking, if they're making sense, and then think about kind of like their background, their history, current events, and maybe thinking about why they're behaving the way that they're behaving. And acknowledge what's valid. So again, that acknowledge what they're thinking, their feelings, and their actions, given the way that they understand the situation, the way that they feel they should be acting in it. And then show equality by being yourself. Don't try to one-up someone. Also, don't try to put someone else down, and treat the other person as an equal, not as fragile or incompetent, even if you feel that they're not acting in a way that makes sense or that even addresses reality or the facts of the situation. It's still important to understand that people's behaviors have causes, and to them what they're doing makes a lot of sense, just as much as what you do makes sense. And so even though it might be hard to empathize or understand that experience, it is important to understand that that experience is also valid, and there's a way that you can discuss with them that experience and maybe add context or help them see a different way.
All right. And then along those same lines with validating others and things like that, can be really important to also bring into mind just the idea of practicing compassion, which can be really important right now, thinking about compassion for yourself, and we'll also talk about compassion for others. But it's a really important place to start with practicing compassion for yourself, because you have to take care of yourself in order to maintain your relationships with other people. So we have this kind of picture and cup on the screen here to kind of represent that metaphor of, if each of these different cups are relationships you have with other people that you pour yourself into, you have to keep mindful of making sure that you also fill up your own pitcher, to fill up your own cup, so that you can continue to give and to be, connected with others around you who you're close to. So another important piece of this is using the communication skills that Erin and I have talked about today to set boundaries and create some me time and some alone time for yourself. That, especially if you're living in a household with several other people, can be really hard to find. So whether that means, getting outside for a walk, or telling somebody I just need the room for like 15 minutes by myself, that can be really important to learn how to communicate those things and make sure you prioritize those things for yourself. It's also really important to think about recognizing for yourself different warning signs that maybe you need a little bit more time for yourself. And that can look a lot of times in people like irritability. So if you're snapping at your friends or your partner or your family a lot, or people are kind of calling you out on it, that's usually a good signal that you maybe need to take a step back and make sure you can have some time to recharge. And the other thing that's important here is that we're spending so much time with other people that we would never normally have so much time to spend with, maybe missing people that we would normally get to see a lot more often. And so that just creates a situation that's ripe for more conflict, more fights, and people hurting, which means that usually we say things sometimes in fights that we regret, or that we wish we hadn't said, that might be hurtful to others. And so if you do find yourself doing that, it's also important not to be too hard on yourself. Don't beat yourself up. If you find that you've done that already, just figure out a way to apologize and try to move on, rather than dwelling on, what that might mean about you or something. This is a tough time for everybody. And then, so yeah, compassion for yourself, but also compassion for other people. And this is probably goes without saying, but because we are in the middle of this crazy pandemic, and now it's been weeks and weeks and weeks of it, everybody's still adjusting and managing and coping in many different ways. So some ways we can kind of cultivate this intentionally is to think about being grateful for the people that we're spending a lot of time with. So maybe keep a small list of things that you really appreciate about the people that you live with, and maybe reflect on that if you're kind of really finding yourself more irritated with other people. And the other point in here I think is important is not to stop keeping score. So some people do that in relationships with people that they live with, of like, well, I've emptied the dishwasher 6 out of the last 7 times, and my partner's only done it once, or kind of just that kind of back and forth, or like mental count you may keep in your head of who's done what, how many times. Because that is something that usually ends up not being productive or helpful. And our phrase about that is that when one person tries to keep score, everybody's losing. So if you find yourself doing that, it's usually a good tip to try to use one of those DEARMANs to ask for a behavior change, or try to communicate if you have some discontent, rather than sitting with it. And the last piece here that I'll elaborate on in the next slides is kind of come up with ways to give others the benefit of the doubt. And this is something that Erin talked a little bit about earlier as well. But we can kind of go into the next slide on a little tiny social psychology lesson about how attributions are, yeah, thanks. This is overall, we think about attributions as a story that we tell ourselves of why somebody did something else. Often we can either say it's because of the person and who they are as a person, or it's because of circumstances or the context. And this can go one way or another. Maybe somebody did that really good thing because they're a really good person, or maybe somebody did that really bad thing because they're a bad person, or maybe it was just a good circumstance for either one of those things to happen. So as people, there's some social psychology experiments that have shown that we often make what's called the fundamental attribution error. And this means that when other people do things that annoy us, it's much more easy to come up with reasons that blame that person and their personality. So if someone cuts us off in traffic, what a jerk. Can't believe they did that. They must cut everyone else off in traffic. That's so annoying. However, when we do something that might be considered annoying or maybe a little bit questionable, usually we come up with really good reasons for ourselves of why those are one-time things because of the circumstances. So if I cut someone else off in traffic, it's definitely because I was running late and that car was going really slow and I just needed to get around it and they were the ones who were annoying. And I'm not a bad person. It just was a weird situation. So we really want to watch ourselves when we're doing this because it's really easy to do when we're in close quarters with people for a long time. When we come up with these reasons of why other people do things, we'll never actually 100% know why somebody did something. So it's really important to check on how we what those reasons that we come up with for ourselves. And so what we do know, so actually a pretty solid body of research, I do research on relationships, especially romantic relationships, and we've found that in stressful times, we're actually happier as people and our relationships are stronger when we can attribute those annoying things about other people to the context rather than who they are as a person. So if we can stop wasting that emotional energy on stewing and really sitting there being like, wow, that person's such a jerk, or they're so lazy, or they're so selfish, they never do anything right, and that's about them as a person, then we can maybe start shifting that energy into something a little bit more neutral or more positive. So if you find yourself maybe upset with somebody or more irritable, it can be helpful to check in and be like, am I thinking that they're doing these things because of who they are? Or can I maybe come up with a few other reasons of why they did that annoying thing? So there's a list of questions here, but I think one of the other ones that's helpful to come back to is, are they in a global pandemic and is the whole world upside down right now? And maybe we can give everybody, which I think applies to most people today, and use kind of these different questions and kind of practice this habit of saying, well, maybe they're not only lazy, maybe they got a bad night's sleep and they're really tired and they didn't even notice that the trash needed to be taken out. So practice that giving the benefit of the doubt to others that you would maybe give to yourself in those situations. So that's my talk on attributions.
Thank you so much, Sarah. So knowledgeable on that subject and many others, of course. So yeah, so that about wraps up what Sarah and I were looking to talk about today. So we do want to open the floor of the chat, meaning you're welcome to unmute yourself to ask a question, or you're welcome to either send to everyone in the chat or to Sarah or I privately a question that you might have about what we discussed today, other general questions about relationships during quarantine that maybe are not related to what we discussed today, but are about relationships, and we'll do our best. And just general thoughts or sharing about COVID-19 and quarantine is also welcome. This is also meant to be supportive, so definitely open to any of those types of questions or comments. And while you're thinking of those or typing up a question, I do just want to go ahead and plug our next workshop. Like I said, we're taking next week off for Memorial Day, but we will be back on June 1st, and we'll be talking about navigating loss of normalcy and future uncertainty during quarantine. And so that experience of missing out on things that normally would be happening. A big one this weekend was graduation for a lot of people in like college or grad school. Were unable to walk or have that ceremony. And then also navigating things like it can be really difficult when planning things for the future, maybe some trips over the summer, unsure if that's actually going to be able to happen. And so like talking about just that general kind of experience and wariness that some people are having. So hope to see you all back then. But that being said, definitely want to leave time for questions or comments. So again, feel free to either unmute yourself and speak up, or you can send something in the chat. So I have a question here that says, what do I do when I Sorry, I just got another message too. This first one says, what do I do when I validate my roommate, but they do not validate me back? So that is a very excellent question. That can be really tough. So I will say that one really great thing about validating other people is it really opens the floor for them to validate you back. And so if you are saying like, okay, I want to make sure that I'm hearing what you're saying, and it seems like you're concerned about this, then it really tends to keep tempers lower and emotions a little more calm, and it allows you to have more of a back and forth. And then also, this is a good time to remember switch tracking as well, which can happen during validation to make sure that everyone's concerns are being addressed. And so if you feel like your roommate or significant other or family member are being invalidating back, it's likely that they're really trying to talk about their thing and really not talk about your thing. So make sure you're not trying to talk about your thing over their thing, because that is invalidating, might make them feel more invalidated and less likely to give you the time to talk about your thing. That might be a good time to say, seems like we both have different concerns and they're both important. Which one should we talk about first? I want to make sure that we have time to talk about both of these things, because this is important to me and this is important to you, which means it's also important to me because I care about you. And so setting aside the time to do that.
Yeah. And I'll jump in and I'll add to that too, that I think it's important just to call to like, I don't know, name what's happening, that, you know, I feel like I validated you in the situation and I feel like I'm really not getting the same response back from you. And I think kind of putting that out there can kind of leave room for also figuring out maybe why that may be happening. Cause I think maybe that person has a hard time coming up with validating and they don't realize that what they're saying is invalidating to you, and kind of opens up the discussion a little bit more if you have a good relationship with them in particular, for kind of being able to kind of have a conversation also about like the process of that conversation that you're having that could happen in the midst of that.
Sure. Thanks so much, Sarah, for adding in those thoughts. Someone else asked about dating during quarantine, which is one of my favorite subjects currently. So I personally feel now is a really wonderful time to be dating people and meeting new people, because there are, especially if you are a dating app user, maybe if you don't usually like to meet people in person, or maybe you usually prefer to meet people in person and don't like the apps. Apps are really the only way people can be safely meeting other single people right now. And so that means there are lots of new people on dating apps and lots of people on dating apps who hate dating apps currently, more now than ever. And so there are lots of people who want to talk with you and who are looking to get off of the dating apps and who are looking to have real conversations with you. And also, a lot of people are kind of bored and have more time on their hands. So, a lot of people are going to be more open to a phone call or a Zoom date than maybe normal, or moving off the app a little more quickly than in the past. And if you do have like a first date over Zoom, a lot less to lose than a first date in person. So if a first date in person goes poorly and a first Zoom date goes poorly, the Zoom date, after some time, you can say, I'm not feeling it, hopefully a little more respectfully than that, and then close your laptop and it's over. Whereas when a first date goes poorly, normally it's longer and you put in a lot more investment. But if they both go well, you kind of get the same thing, where you've made a connection with someone else that you can explore. And that's a really positive thing either way. Sarah, I don't know if you wanted to add to that.
No, I feel like you covered it. That's most of, and I think the thing I wanted to add is what you said at the end, is that I think it is good to think about that, like, yeah, how much almost more efficient it might be to kind of start getting to know somebody and not having to go like get dressed up, go travel somewhere, put all this time investment into meeting someone for the first time. You can do it over Zoom first.
Yeah, it's an exciting time. There are lots of it's an exciting time for people who study relationships, which both Sarah and I do. Lots of people are thinking new things. Lots of thought pieces are being written. A lot of people are, other types of professionals are adapting their business practices to address people dating in quarantine. And so definitely lots of resources are being created on that, new ones every day.
For sure.
All right, I want to see if there's any more questions. All right. Well, I want to thank everyone for coming today. Appreciate it so much. Um, Appreciate everyone's participation. I want to again thank my co-facilitator, Sarah Giff, for joining me today and offering her expertise and wisdom on the subject. Thank you to everyone else for joining today, and I hope to see you on June 1st.
All right. Thank you very much. Bye.